Often considered the physical embodiment of British Leyland's troubled tenure, the Triumph TR7 and its many variants had all the potential to work on paper, the concept being for a low-slung sports car that would be dedicated for sale in the United States, as supported by the well-established Triumph marque that had seen major success on the American market through the likes of the Spitfire and the TR6. Sadly, there were far too many faults and poor decisions to ever allow the TR7 a chance to truly be the must-have sports car originally envisaged by the British Leyland management, as a culmination of design flaws, poor reliability, a delayed launch due to militant strike action, and a lack of performance when compared to its rivals, meant what was supposed to be BL's barnstorming American adventure was over before it had ever truly begun. Prior to the TR7, British Leyland's progenitors, MG and Austin Healey of the British Motor Corporation, and Triumph of the Leyland Group, were masters of selling cheap but perky sports cars in the United States, the MGB, the Sprite, the Midget and the Spitfire, all being exceptional successes that were consistently the highest-selling British cars on the American market. By far the biggest seller in the USA for the British motor industry was MG, which, through its MGB and Midget, outsold the likes of the Triumph Spitfire and TR6 by a considerable margin, but this would become a bone of contention once BMC and the Leyland Group merged in 1968 to form British Leyland, it being evident that both the flagship MGB and TR6 were nearing the end of their useful lives despite healthy sales in America. In this regard, the MG Midget and the Triumph Spitfire were aimed at the same customers, while the Triumph TR6, GT6 and MGB were not too dissimilar in their market appeal either, the result being that there were 5 models competing in pretty much the same sector, and were thus selling in comparatively small numbers when put against the likes of other sub-2-litre cars produced by British Leyland at the time. At the time of the merger, both MG at Abingdon and Triumph at Canley were already in the midst of developing replacements for their MGB and TR6, with the former creating the ADO21, which was a sharp-nosed 2-seater sports car with a mid-engine configuration that also carried over many technical aspects from the regular saloon car range, including its engine and hydroelastic suspension. Over at Triumph, initial work had also started on its own sports car, codenamed Bullet, which, unlike the MG ADO21, was a more conventional affair with a front-engine configuration based on saloon car running gear, the Triumph Bullet offering everything that the Americans told the British they wanted from their sports cars, being mechanically simple and thus giving a greater potential for long-term reliability. As far as British Leyland was concerned, that made it a preferable option to the ADO21 for the company's corporate sports car, with the management aware that it had to pitch any new sports cars at an increasingly sophisticated clientele with care, especially in consideration of a new crop of far more modern alternatives coming onto the market, such as the Datsun 240Z and the Porsche 914. To that end, the Datsun and the Porsche were the benchmarks from which to base the upcoming British Leyland sports car, matching them on both reliability and technical interest, while at the same time adhering to new crash legislation that was being introduced in the USA, which was considered by many senior figures in the global motor industry to be the death knell for the concept of open-top sports cars. With this in mind, British Leyland were under severe pressure to deliver a minimum of one sports car in a very limited time and under a very strict budget, while at the same time being presented with the issue of marketing, with Mike Carver, then a manager in central product planning, and Speke King, travelling to the United States in late 1970 in order to sound out dealers and try to understand the tastes of the American buying public. The fact that Speke King, at the time the chief engineer at Triumph, would be so intimately involved in the early stages of the new car's development ensured that Triumph, as a marque, would get the inside track, despite the fact that of British Leyland's many sports cars, the MG brand was by far the most popular in the United States. The result of this fact-finding mission would prove surprising, because it indicated that what Americans really wanted was a conventionally engineered front-engined rear-wheel drive car, the reasoning being that the greatest desire of these machines was for reliability and the availability for a quick fix should the car fail. The product planners reasoned that this format also had advantages in terms of development, and the fact that it would be less costly for the company both in terms of time and finances, Donald Stokes, chairman of British Leyland, demanding that this prospective car be ready to sell by the mid-1970s, and suggested that component sharing with regular mass-production models would reduce the development time. Because the dealers wanted a car that occupied a similar place in the market to that of their biggest seller, the MGB, the advantages of the mid-engined layout were lessened significantly, with performance that could not exploit the 50-50 weight distribution, while the budget would eventually become the deciding factor as to the adoption of a conventional front-engine rear-wheel drive configuration. Out of the MG and Triumph models in development, it was obvious that the Triumph Bullet would be the model to be honed into production readiness. Work on the Bullet in earnest having commenced during 1969, with the Triumph engineers envisaging it as a combined GT6 TR6 replacement, with prototypes soon running with Triumph 4 and 6-cylinder power units. Once the green light had been given to the Bullet project by the British Leyland board, the full weight of the company's resources were put behind the development of the new Triumph at the beginning of 1971, with Stokes setting the deadline for this new car at 1975, the Bullet essentially filling the role of a cheaper front-engine version of the Volkswagen Porsche 914, but would be target-topped like the Fiat X19. As long as the threat of banning full convertibles in America remained looming, British Leyland refused from the start to introduce such a specification on the Bullet project, and would instead leave it to the pre-existing MGB to remain on sale as the company's flagship drop-top sports car until such time that the legislation demanded these cars be removed from sale. However, product planning decided that even though the new car was conceived as a straight replacement for the MGB, it should be priced above the older car so that there was no clash between the MG and the Triumph, and thus this would immediately drag the Bullet away from its intended market, the concept of the car having been generally finalized, though the finer details still had to be decided upon. Speke was therefore placed in charge of the development of the new car, and employed his design philosophy of presenting an outwardly futuristic-looking car, but with highly conventional underpinnings, as per the later Rover SD1 and Austin Maestro. The engine would be developed from the Slant 4 Dolomite engine, initially coming with a 4-speed gearbox developed from the Morris Marina and live rear axle, while the option of a Triumph Straight 6 powered version was dropped in favour of the Rover V8, which at the time was being used in the Rover P5B, P6B and the Range Rover. King was an expert of honing conventional components into something comparable with more exotic rivals, and even though the rear suspension was not independent, with careful development and thoughtful axle location, it proved possible to make the car ride and handle at least as well as its foreign competition, presenting a notable improvement over the earlier MGB and TR6. Come 1972, the heavy slant placed in favour of the Triumph marque by the former Triumph chairman Donald Stokes meant the new flagship sports car for British Leyland would be sold under this brand, with MG maintaining the MGB, while the TR6 and GT6 would be axed upon the launch of this new machine. However, during the early stages of development at Longbridge, TR7-shaped clay models were produced wearing the MG Magna nameplate, which proved to be something of an unenthusiastic attempt to present an MG version of the upcoming car for possible badge engineering purposes, though in the end, the notion of selling both an MG and Triumph version of the car in the United States made little sense economically. Regardless, now that the product planners had decided that the Triumph TR7 would not replace the MGB, the new task for the upcoming car was to fight competitors higher up the price scale, meaning its simplicity could prove to be a hurdle for sales, while even with the extra equipment added to the car, in order to become a price replacement for the TR6 or GT6, the mechanical layout was far too unsophisticated to match its foreign rivals. With this in mind, the Longbridge Design Studio was asked to restyle the car in order to increase its appeal, and thus Harris Mann, chief stylist of British Leyland, was handed the new TR7 project for his consideration, following the end of his work on the Allegro-based ADO68 Project Condor Sports Coupe, the ADO71 Princess range, and the exceptional Austin Zander concept car. Under Mann's direction, he honed the styling of the car in order to give it a more expensive look, while at the same time attempted to incorporate the required 5-mile-an-hour impact-absorbing bumpers so as to meet American legislation, the most startling aspect of the car's styling being its belt line, which was slashed down the side in a high-to-low arc that was believed would help emphasize the model's low-slung profile. Though the inclusion of this design feature had been considered somewhat questionable, it did give the TR7 a distinct identity against the original Bullet, while elements of the ADO21 design were also included, in particular relating to its pointed nose and pop-up headlights, though the original notion of a target top was dropped completely due to the ever-present ban on convertibles remaining punishingly apparent. As development progressed, by 1972 it became clear that the TR7 should be the starting point for a modest range of sports cars, with this model, from its launch, being considered the base model in the new product lineup, while the highest trim version of the car would sport the powerful and robust Rover V8 power unit. Below that, the 16-valve version of the slant-4 Dolomite engine, at the time under development by Speke and being readied for the Dolomite Sprint, was also earmarked to form the basis of the TR7 Sprint, while beyond this extending of the range of engines, as the Pioneer TR7 model neared its formal announcement, development of a 2+2 version commenced, with a view to widening the appeal of the corporate sports car. The thinking behind this car, called the Triumph Lynx, was that with its extended accommodation, it could be an effective competitor to the Ford Capri, a car which was proving to be a runaway hit for Ford, and, in the process, was reinventing the sports car market for the UK and Europe, with the V8-engined Lynx being provided to replace the trebled Triumph Stag, which at the time was costing British Leyland dearly in warranty costs. In terms of production, the Speke factory in Liverpool was chosen to build the TR7 from the time of its 1975 American press launch, the North American market being so important to British Leyland that the usual process of final testing and honing was dropped in order to get the car on sale as early as possible. The decision was also taken to launch the Triumph TR7 in the USA only, with European and British cars entering sales once demand had been identified and production could be increased, the onus now very much being on the Speke workforce to produce the car at an acceptable level of quality, ensuring that the first positive impressions of what was meant to be a Porsche-killer would remain with the car throughout its life. In the end, the resultant car was not a technical tour de force by any aspect, but did present many endearing features at the time of its launch, with the TR7 being very safety-conscious and thus designed with a monocoque that met all upcoming American crash regulations, and intelligent detailing in the structure meant that the car would prove to score well in passive safety terms. While the car may have looked to incorporate an integral roll hoop, though in reality it didn't, the rear three-quarter pillar was immensely strong thanks to the integrated box sections that stretched all the way up to the roofline and a cantrail over the windows. One interesting aspect of the crash structure, and one that marked the car as being ahead of the game in this respect, was that the front section of the body shell did not contribute much in the event of a head-on collision, but merely acted as a crumple zone, with the major energy in such a collision being absorbed by the wheels against the bulkhead and the engine against the scuttle. Body shell strength was also above average for the time, at 7,500 pounds-feet per degree, but it was not the safety or strength of the Triumph TR7's body that drew comment, but rather its style, with one amusing anecdote of the time being that renowned Italian designer Giorgetto Giugiaro was so puzzled and bemused by the car's aesthetic that he could not believe that it was meant to be a production model. Nevertheless, the TR7 was launched on time in January 1975 as an exclusive model for the United States, with American journalists reporting on the car a full year ahead of their counterparts on the domestic market, the launch of the car going off without a hitch, and saw contemporary American motoring critics generally impressed with the model, though the styling was something they struggled to appreciate. Going beyond its exterior, though, the TR7 proved to illustrate many laudable feats, including its handling and ride, while the chassis was capable of providing comfort and habitability for the passengers that far exceeded many of its contemporaries, and thus made it far more livable for a model within the sports car class. Because of strict emissions laws that were in force in the United States by 1975, extensive anti-smog equipment was installed in the TR7, thus meaning that the already underpowered 8-valve 2-litre engine would suffer heavily from this dramatic loss of performance, though the car, in order to meet differing emissions legislation, was also offered with 90-horsepower twin Stromberg carburetors in 49-state tune and a smaller 76-horsepower in single-carburetor California tune. The reality was, though, that British Leyland had not an engine in their arsenal that could suitably match the emissions legislation for the United States other than the high-end Rover V8, with American journalists calling upon British Leyland to introduce a more powerful unit for the TR7 in order to provide it with the performance it truly deserved, though British Leyland were already working on the concept at the time of the launch. As for the UK and Europe, these markets would have to wait until May 19, 1976, before the TR7 was introduced, with domestic journalists treating the model as a new car, despite it having entered sales over a year prior in America, European cars being notably different from the US models, with smaller rear bumpers and an unmodified 105-horsepower engine being employed due to the less restrictive legislation. The result was that the untamed TR7 could provide a more class-competitive performance on the domestic market, with a 0-60 time of 9.4 seconds and a top speed of 110 miles an hour, as opposed to the 11 seconds and 107 miles an hour of its American cousins, though neither version of the Triumph could match the 3-litre power of the rival Ford Capri, Though at a price of £2,999, it did prove to be some £696 cheaper than the Capri. In terms of domestic reviews, the car, at the time of its 1976 launch, remained generally impressive, considering it to be perfectly serviceable for its class, but perhaps slightly underpowered for motorway cruising or long-distance drives on straight roads, but the comfortable chassis and appealing interior layout received universal praise. Inevitably, because of the passing resemblance between the two cars, the Triumph TR7 and Fiat X19 would each end up being compared, with Autocar magazine determining through focus groups that the Italian X19 had a touch more visual appeal than the Triumph, and was particularly popular among women regardless of the performance merits of either car. This was perhaps the nub of the problem for the Triumph TR7, as the car lacked the face value sex appeal of its exotic rivals, while inexpensive modifications to the TR7 could have easily reversed this situation, including the utilization of more appealing colors and paint schemes, but this was unfortunately not taken forward. However, one place the Triumph TR7 did find appeal was on the rally stage, as from its European launch in 1976, British Leyland ran a team of TR7s that initially used the 16-valve Dolomite Sprint engine before switching to the Rover V8, these cars being reasonably successful on tarmac events, but were less successful on gravel sections, with the most successful TR7 V8 driver being Tony Pond. Nevertheless, John Buffum would bring home victory at the SCCA Pro Rally Championship from 1977 to 1980, driving TR7 and TR7 V8 cars, while Group 44 ran two TR8 cars in the Trans Am and IMSA Championship from 1978 to 1981, followed in Canada by the third IMSA car that would run with support from JRT Canada until 1985, the Group 44 effort leading to many wins of the TR8 in the USA, and was the most successful campaign of this type of car. Unfortunately, while the TR7 was a somewhat polarizing machine upon its launch in both the United States and Europe, praised for its comfort but criticized for its styling and performance, none of its potential facets mattered when faced with the industrial strife that would come to ruin the machine's chances of truly being a world beater on the sports car scene. In October 1976, the workforce at the Speke factory, where the TR7 was being produced, went on strike over matters relating to manning at the Triumph No. 2 plant, resulting in 1,500 layoffs at the Merseyside factory, together with another 2,000 redundancies in Coventry that affected Dolomite production, this industrial dispute lasting for 17 straight weeks throughout the winter of 1976 and into early 1977. With the rise of Michael Edwards to the rank of chairman of British Leyland during November 1977, rumours began to circulate that the plant would be closed, with the loss of 6,000 jobs, thus widening the confrontation and seeing the new chairman brought before the British Prime Minister James Callaghan to explain himself. Edwards would ultimately declare that, in order to keep the TR7 in production, it would need to have its assembly transferred from the militant Speke factory to a plant that was more amenable, despite Callaghan considering that it would be preferable to scrap the model entirely rather than move its production. More pressing were the trade unions, who took an intense dislike to the new management regime, which they felt was putting the financial interests of the company ahead of its workers, while Edwards, during February 1978, laid out his plans to save the company to a delegation of 720 shop stewards, union and employee representatives, explaining how cuts needed to be made to the firm's excesses in order to save the wider industry. While Edwards was able to receive the backing of this delegation with a majority of 715 to 5, strike action by the unions remained the first option rather than a last resort, with Longbridge, Cowley, Solihull, Candley and Speke all coming out on strike thanks to militant shop stewards, defiant of the management and unafraid to use the withdrawal of labour as their primary weapon of intimidation. To demonstrate that he would not be held hostage by the unions, Edwards made the rumours of Speke's closure very real during the spring of 1978, initially declaring that he would downscale operations at the plant by transferring Triumph TR7 production over to Candley near Coventry, this move drawing the ire of the shop stewards, who immediately staged a strike in protest. Assembly line staff would stage sit-ins at the factory, which obstructed all work, while out of solidarity to their colleagues on Merseyside, the Candley plant also performed a sit-in, this move only serving to call Edwards' hand, and thus he made the clear ultimatum that if they did not desist in this action, he would have no choice but to close down the entire factory. In consideration of the massive redundancies and the damage to the local economy, the unions considered this threat as merely a bluff, but after protracted union belligerence at the Merseyside plant, which involved not only sit-ins but also acts of sabotage, Edwards followed through with his threat and closed down the entire car-producing facility with the government's backing. The cost of this action had been huge, not only in terms of jobs lost in the Merseyside area, but also in terms of future production cars, with the promising V8 engine Triumph Lynx, nearing production at the time, being cancelled immediately. The Triumph Lynx had been the long-standing proposal to replace the struggling Stag of 1970, and consisted of an almost fully unmodified TR7 front, being married to a brand new middle and rear body and a stylish hatchback design that could have been targeted directly at the likes of the Datsun 240Z, while the provision of the Rover V8 engine would have made it the top-of-the-range model for the prospective Triumph series of sports cars. Coming in the form of a four-seater coupe, and powered by both four-cylinder and V8 engines, the long-term intention was to badge the model as an MG for 2-litre inline-4 versions, thus replacing the MGB GT, while the Triumph mark would be applied to the V8-powered flagship, the car's most significant modification being the extension of the wheelbase by 12 inches and the incorporation of longer passenger doors. The rear suspension of the Lynx would also be shared with the Rover ST1, and comprised a solid rear axle with intelligent location and dampening, the overall packaging for the Lynx being very viable, while an excess of capacity at the Speke plant meant it could be produced at this facility without robbing the regular TR7 of assembly assets, thus leading to approval being given for the car to enter production in late 1977. However, by the time the tooling was ready to be installed at Speke, the strike action of early 1978 had started, thus leading to its eventual closure, and with no extra capacity available once TR7 production was moved to Canley, combined with a lack of potential demand by American dealerships for a four-seater coupe in the vein of the Lynx, meant the entire project was scrapped. Also lost was the TR7 Sprint, a version of the car that was developed with a 16-valve power unit from the Triumph Dolomite Sprint that included 58 prototypes built between February and October 1977, alongside pre-production models for dedicated TR7 convertibles and TR7 V8s, with a production run of around 30 cars being built on the Speke assembly line during June 1977. With Speke's closure the following year, the TR7 Sprint was axed too, though much of the reason as to why production wasn't transferred to Canley came down to the sales and marketing department, who claimed its performance wasn't sufficient, and the Sprint engine was unsuitable for emission control equipment in America, even though the car had a top speed and 0-60 time comparable to the 135 horsepower Rover V8 fitted to TR8s on the US market. Nevertheless, with the closure of Speke, TR7 production was brought to a halt as tooling and equipment was transferred to the Canley plant and assembly brought up to speed, while the wider ambitions of a TR7-based sports car range died along with the Merseyside factory, as Edwards focused on ensuring that what little money was being given to the company by the government was channeled into the development of the LC8 and LC10 hatchbacks. Fortunately, by this point, a dedicated V8 version of the car was nearing completion, and with the backing of significant demand by the American market, this was enough to bring the model to fruition, while at the same time, the threat of banning convertibles in the United States had fallen away from 1976 onwards, thus meaning the long-awaited drop-top TR7 could finally be put into development. The transfer of production to Canley also produced results when it came to quality control and minor modifications to improve the car's mechanics and styling, including the fitment of a 77mm 5-speed gearbox from the Rover ST1, together with a widening of the range of colours, a smartening of interior trim, and the addition of a bonnet power bulge in preparation for V8-powered versions of the car. The opportunity was also taken to incorporate running changes to the car as part of a wider midlife upgrade to the TR7 model, with the upgrading of the electrics, instrumentation and cooling being implemented at Canley due to the industrial strife at Speke having diverted attention away from this critical part of keeping the car mechanically relevant. Finally, a convertible version of the TR7 appeared in May 1979, but this was again an exclusive model for the United States and would not be released domestically until March 1980, though regardless, the drop-top TR7 was by far the pinnacle of the machine's styling prowess, with the awkward hardtop roof design now being omitted and the slash down the profile now complementing rather than detracting from the model's aesthetic. At the same time, the TR8 also entered pre-production at Canley, with the prototypes being outshopped as hardtop examples during early testing, though for the actual production series TR8, the car would be sold exclusively as a convertible in order to maximize on the positive reception garnered for the TR7 drop-top variants, the new V8 model once again being an American exclusive upon its launch in May 1980. To accommodate the convertible roof, The structure of the body shell was strengthened by way of an additional box section being installed behind the seats, which linked the B-post together, while strengthened quarter panels were also added alongside an end-weighted front bumper, which was used to reduce the effects of scuttle shake, the outcome being the drop-head TR7 and TR8 being slightly lighter than the fixed-head versions. Alongside the regular convertible and the TR8, a joint MG Triumph project to produce a new sports car based on the TR7 also underwent early conception during 1979 under the name Project Broadside, this car being based on an extension to the TR7 platform by 5 inches and the fitting of either an O Series or Rover V8 engine in both drop-head and fastback body styles, though the Broadside scheme would ultimately fail due to a lack of funding. Following the collapse of Broadside in mid-1979, this was immediately followed by another exercise of badge engineering in the form of Project Boxer, an MG version of the TR7 that would have potentially replaced the MGB, and came in the guise of various concepts as put forward by British Leyland's American headquarters at Leonia, New Jersey. Project Boxer comprised major changes to the standard TR7 hardtop, and included the addition of an MG-styled grille to the nose panel, forward-folding headlights similar to those of the Porsche 928, and a new tail panel with light units from the Rover SD1, though this scheme was ultimately rejected on the grounds that the car was insufficiently different from the regular TR7. Finally, there was the creation of approximately 25 TR7 prototypes fitted with the O-Series engine that were developed at Canley during the late 1970s and early 1980s, with turbocharged versions being recorded as the fastest Triumph cars ever built, when they attained a top speed of 132 miles an hour at the Myra test track, though this project again failed to reach fruition. Regardless, the release of a V8-powered Triumph sports car, as well as it being a convertible, injected a new breath of fresh air into the model, with performance and economy being excellent, while the aluminium alloy engine was perfectly suited to the job of being the power unit for a drop-top car, the TR8 being by far the pinnacle of the TR7's design prowess, even if it was 5 years too late. Motoring critics on both sides of the Atlantic praised the model as a full reinvention of the sports car, with domestic reviewers being more reserved than those in America, but concluded in its road test that the TR8 represented a significant development over the original TR7, proving to be slightly quicker and more economical as well. Thus, the TR8 was set to become the market beater hoped for by the British Leyland management after years of industrial strife and underperformance, but sadly the new car came at precisely the wrong time due to the onset of the 1979 oil crisis as caused by the Iranian Revolution, which made the purchase of V8-powered cars deeply unattractive. This alone was not the main reason as to the TR8's woes, as coupled to the economic recession that followed the oil crisis, exchange rates moved in favour of a strong pound against the American dollar, and thus meant that buying import models in the United States was more expensive than procuring domestic sports cars like the Chevrolet Corvette. In the end, while the Triumph TR8 was ultimately given a limited release in the UK during December 1980, only 35 of the 2,715 units of this model were produced in right-hand drive, its domestic launch coinciding with yet another move of assembly for the car from Canley to the relatively new Solihull factory south of Birmingham, where it would be built alongside the Rover SD1. In reality, this move was simply a last-minute reshuffling before the administering of several major cuts by Sir Michael Edwards, including the closure of the Canley factory and the demise of the Triumph TR7 and TR8 in its entirety, once he had identified the savings that could be made by closing the nearly new Rover SD1 assembly lines at Solihull. In May 1981, British Leyland made public its plans to remove the TR7 and TR8 from production, though Ray Horrocks made it clear that the car's assembly could be continued if demand for the model improved in significant quantities, though with the poor exchange rate and impact of the oil crisis, seeing exported TR7s and TR8s piling up in stockyards across America, it was evident that this minimum quota would not be met. Therefore, the closure of the Rover SD1 assembly lines at Solihull was made during October 1981, thus resulting in the loss of 3,000 jobs and the Triumph TR7 and TR8. These redundancies coming alongside losses at what remained of the Speke factory, the Swindon body pressing plant, and the Wellingborough foundry in Northamptonshire. With sports cars clearly having fallen out of favour with the buying public both domestically and internationally, especially with the rise of practical but performance-orientated hatchbacks as per the Volkswagen Golf and Talbot Sunbeam, all of British Leyland's remaining sports models would be wound up by the end of 1982 with no direct replacement. The MGB, which had remained in production throughout the course of the TR7's lifespan, was axed alongside the traditional MG home factory of Abingdon during 1980, despite the fact that, even though the car had lost 50% of its sales demand since 1977, it was still remaining financially buoyant in the USA, the MG brand ultimately outliving the more prestigious Triumph name when it was transferred onto tuned versions of British Leyland's family car range. As for the future potential of the TR7 range, evidence suggested that a version of the car fitted with an O-Series engine may have sold enough to keep the MG mark afloat into the late 1980s, with American dealers pleading directly to Sir Michael Edwards to save the mark when the Abingdon plant faced closure, claiming that an O-Series engine would have trimmed costs, but ultimately these appeals fell on deaf ears. Another potential revival for the TR7 range came through the arrival of the DeLorean Motor Company of Northern Ireland during 1982, which itself had entered administration on February 19th of the same year, after a disastrous entry into the marketplace during January 1981, with DMC's purchasing director, Barry Willis, and Chuck Bennington approaching British Leyland with the idea of purchasing the tooling and rights for the TR7. The concept was to build DMC badge TR7s and TR8s at the larger but underutilized Dunmurry factory near Belfast, with July 29, 1982, seeing Austin Rover's chairman Harold Musgrove and British Leyland's commercial director Mark Snowden agree that DMC could procure the rights and tooling for a commercially realistic price, as long as the car they produced didn't too closely resemble the original TR7 or TR8. In essence, this plan could have rescued the DeLorean company, with the sale of the smaller, rebranded cars opening up the possibility of volume production to the Dunmurry plant, and the plan proved to be impressive enough to warrant a commitment to funding from a consortium of financial backers with the agreement of the receivers. Sadly, the deal to utilize the TR7 or TR8 could not save the firm from its inevitable collapse, and amid the arrest of company founder John DeLorean for brokering cocaine deals in order to provide short-term capital for the firm during October 1982, the DMC company folded completely, and thus the TR7 design would not see a revival under the DeLorean brand. In the end, approximately 115,000 TR7s were built, including 28,864 convertibles and approximately 2,800 TR8s, while the Triumph name was transferred onto a Cowley-built version of the Honda Ballad during 1981 that would come to pass as the Triumph Acclaim, though this car proved to be merely a stopgap in a wider British Leyland initiative to employ Honda mechanics to improve their reliability, and will come to an end in 1984 alongside the entire Triumph marque. Today, the Triumph TR7 and TR8 are often considered one of the worst failures in British automotive history, though not for commercial reasons, as despite the troubles at the Speke factory, the transfer of production twice, and various other delays in getting the car sold both domestically and internationally, the number of TR7s and TR8s produced is comparable to the earlier Triumph TR5 and TR6. The reason why the TR7 is considered a failure is more for the fact that it was the physical incarnation of all that was wrong with British Leyland, being the face of industrial strife, poor build quality, unusual styling that was considered dubious at best and brash at worst, and a premature discontinuation under the management of Sir Michael Edwards as he sought to cut the terrible losses being made by the firm. Nevertheless, the TR7 and TR8 were also much-loved models for their time, and even illustrated sustainable sales in the United States, even as the market for sports cars shrank during the late 1970s, the terrible tragedy of these cars being the fact that they could have been so much more, as attested to by stillborn projects such as the Lynx, Boxer and Broadside, which could have been the range of cars necessary to ensure the future of the Triumph brand.